Good morning. My name is Daniel Murray. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity at Stanford. It is my pleasure to welcome you to day 2 of our conference, the 2021 Tech and Racial Equity Conference, Anti-Racist Technologies for a Just Future. I want to start by thanking our sponsors. We had a lot of help and a lot of collaboration from the Stanford Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society, the Digital Civil Society Lab, the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, HI, and the Program on African American Studies. Thanks a lot for all of the support to make this conference possible. We had a great day yesterday, and we are excited for day 2. We have 2 great panels this morning. The first on racial justice in digital agri-food systems, a topic that some folks may not be familiar with, but a place where technology is doing a lot of work and raising a lot of questions. So we're excited to get into it. Then after that, we'll have a panel on police technology and abolitionist movements. And then we hope you will come back later today for our keynote, the conclusion of the conference at 4 o'clock. We will have the 16th annual Anne and Lauren Kiva Distinguished Lecture featuring Professor Ruha Benjamin, Professor of African American Studies at Princeton, and a leading public intellectual on racial justice and technology. It's going to be a great conversation. We hope you can join us. You should see on your window, if you're watching on the CCSRE website, a box to add your questions. We hope you will join the conversation with us today. We should have some time in both of these panels and our event later to hear from you folks. But without further ado, I'd like to get into our first panel and hand it off to one of our CCSRE, DCSL, HAI Practitioner Fellows, Samir Doshi.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Greetings, everyone. My name is Samir Doshi. I use he, him pronouns. I'm sitting right now in Huichin territory in the East Bay, in San Francisco Bay Area. And just really excited to be sharing these topics with you all today. We're going to be talking about digital agri-food systems and centering racial equity, labor, and the impacts on communities. It's often a conversation that gets hidden and is understated. So in terms of our expanded definition of workers, we're going to be discussing farm workers, growers, but then also smallholder farmers. And the geographic focus will be teasing around a couple of different places in the US and Canada, also in Ghana, and then looking at the African food system and then the global food system. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen and give you all just a brief rundown of our agenda for today. So we're going to be having just, 4 speakers, 3 really brilliant folks coming on to talking in depth. I'm going to be leading with just an overview and a framing of the topics to set everybody else up. And then we'll have David Selassie Opoku talking about smallholder farmers in Ghana, Sarah Rotz, who's an assistant professor at York University, talking about political economy of data and food and land sovereignty. And our last speaker is Erik Nicholson of Pandion Strategy, really focusing on workers and racial justice. And then we're going to hopefully try to have the last 20 minutes or so for discussion. So yeah, we'd love to get into kind of a fertile, active, dynamic discussion. As I'm sure many of you know, this is quite an emerging field that has a lot of investment and attraction. And I think what we're seeking to do is really add some critical inquiry to it. So I'm just going to start here with the overview. And really want to start off by talking about this framing that is really common in digital agri-food systems. There was a study from Wageningen University that basically did text analysis for over 100 reports and advertisements in ag tech And almost all of them kind of came through this same logic framing of really the need to increase global food security, right? So it runs down these kind of 5 different presumptions, starting off with kind of population growth that, we need to feed 10 billion people by 2050, and that these following presumptions, this requires 70% more food to be produced. So a really strong emphasis on yields is often seen. Then we have a finite amount of land and resources to produce food. And this requires, in order to meet that need, more information, more service tools, and more labor to increase those yields. And the last presumption in this narrative is that digital technologies can meet these needs. I think what we're really wanting to do in this panel is to bring about a really critical inquiry around these sets of presumptions, especially grounding that in racial justice, in worker justice, in communities, and then also show different ways that this narrative doesn't hold up. I have a kind of a quote here. Well, 2 quotes, one from Bill Gates and one from this new Google X project. And again, you're seeing kind of this narrative that's really being pushed front and center with it. So I'm just going to do a really quick overview of the current food system. It's a massive topic. I'm going to give less time than each of these areas deserve, but ultimately want to show the larger framing of where our food system is and where our problems really are presenting themselves. So in terms of the current conventional food system, I think a lot of these overall impacts are well known. Agriculture is a major driver for greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. It's one of the largest impacts on land use and actually on deforestation, especially in the Amazon through livestock and other expansion. It is a very large user of fresh water and a big impact on freshwater security, both from the amount of use and then on the pollution from a lot of the runoff from agriculture. So that's where the eutrophication part comes in. And then lastly, just looking at the biodiversity impact. So overall, we see quite a dismal picture in terms of the ecological impacts of conventional agriculture. Next, kind of moving into health, this came from the IPES recent report on the food health nexus. And I think just really landing the health impacts of the conventional food system. So we start looking at these kind of 5 areas of occupational hazards, environmental contamination, contaminated foods, food insecurity, and diets. On the left image and on the right image, it's how a lot of those impacts show up in the financial system, which is one way of measuring it, but just really looking at how large that is. In the past year, in the pandemic, we've seen, in terms of the impact on workers, especially in the US and Canada, but also obviously globally, farmers and kind of these frontline and essential workers, from farmers to meat processing workers to factory workers, retail workers, and others, just all along the food value chain, how even though they're essential, they've been dismissed in terms of their value, and the number of COVID rates that have just been spiking amongst those communities is just really, really distressing. Moving on to kind of socioeconomics, there's a number of different areas where these impacts show up. Specifically in the US, we have this image to the left and in the bottom, the privatization of US farmland that, over 96% of acres and 97% of wealth and value is owned by white farmers. And in the bottom right, we kind of see this trajectory specifically with Black land ownership that has just been decimated in terms of the number of farmers and the number of acres that are owned by Black farmers, dropping immensely, just in the past century. And really, a lot of those numbers are between kind of 1910, 1920, and 1990. And then the top right, just another area that we're showing up is in terms of worker wages. So the pandemic has shown to be a huge boom for a lot of retailers and a lot of online commerce. And yet, all of those billions of dollars and even trillions of dollars that have been accrued rarely make their way onto the worker. So we're really starting to look at the corporatization of the food system. This image, we're showing consolidation around different corporations. So on the left image is, various food industries and how 10 industries control so much of the global supply chain. On the right side, we're really seeing these different commodity corporations that are also controlling massive supply chains. Also, in terms of trade and purchasing policies, we had one of the largest protests in the world with the Indian farmers. And these aren't agroecological or regenerative ag farmers. These are conventional farmers that have really been affected by pricing and the policies that the Indian government has put in place that dramatically harm their livelihoods. And there's been already so many issues, from farmer suicides in India to just general livelihood equity, that have been impacted. On the right side, just acknowledging the policies of land sovereignty for indigenous communities, in North America, but around the world, really, really critical. And then on the bottom, this aspect of food apartheid, of really the massive levels of hunger and malnutrition that we see in the world. The reason that food apartheid is coming up as a concept is because it's not just a food desert. It's not a natural phenomenon. These levels of hunger are really designed into our system. So we come back with this larger narrative, and I apologize for just really running through that quickly, but wanting to land across each of these systems that our current conventional food system is racist, it is sexist, it is classist, and it's environmentally toxic. And again, this isn't incidental. This is really by design, that a lot of the current corporate and political power structures that have moved towards consolidation, that have moved towards these global supply chains, that have reduced the equity of workers, of communities of color, both in the global north and in the global south. It's just a really systemic issue in terms of where we need to really look to advance change. So when we come back to this aspect of technology, the issue is that often technology is used to optimize kind of a single function or a few functions. And it's rarely able to be deployed to address wholesale systems. So if we're focusing just on yields, or if we're focusing just on hunger, it can definitely be to the detriment to a lot of these other systems. What we really need is large-scale change and transformative change across all these systems, and not preferencing one over the other. And I think what the really powerful aspect is we have a lot of knowledge in terms of what can be done and what needs to be done. And then the question is, how can technology really come in and serve that? So moving on kind of the tech side and the tech framing of where it shows up in agriculture, I love this quote by Kentaro Toyama, who was one of the original researchers on ICT4D and digital development. Technology is an exacerbator. So where you have a highly inequitable system and an inequitable environment, when we drop in technology, it exacerbates those inequities. But if you have a system that is more equitable, then when you drop in technology, it actually can help and support. So these are critical areas when we're thinking of technology as not being apolitical. It is definitely political, and it's not objective. It's really determined by the environment in which it sits. This is something that I've just started developing kind of in the past year, a framework around technologies in agriculture and kind of the history of agriculture, really as an orientation for where is this kind of new digital technology revolution that we're talking about going into, and where is the histories of it coming from before. So this kind of first aspect I'm looking at is mechanical technologies, the AgTech 1.0, and kind of in the service provision side, or is it on a data function side? In service provision, tractors and harvesters. And I just want to note, coming back to our theme, that there's a lot of almost romanticization of tractors being able to open up and improve agriculture for yields and being able to feed people. But here in the US, this sort of mechanization was one of the major ways that we saw a reduction in Black farmers, that they were actually driven out of the South as we're able to replace a lot of the labor that was originally free enslaved labor, which is how the US and the global North food system, and even kind of the entire global food system, was able to be supported, was on enslaved free labor. And as we had more automation and we could start replacing and displacing that sort of labor, it pushed a lot of African Americans out of their land in the South. And this was a really fascinating study that was done by civil rights leader Bayard Rustin in the 60s, of showing these pushes and shifts. So again, not looking at technologies kind of apolitical and agnostic. The second AgTech 2.0 is on biochemical technology. So this is where we're seeing a lot of chemical ag inputs leading to the green revolution, and just a number of different impacts that have come out of that. And then the last one, what we're really focusing on, is this kind of AgTech 3.0 around digital technologies. And there's a number of ways this shows up, both on the data side and on the service provision side. I'm emphasizing this mainly because we have a long history of technology in agriculture. So as these narratives that are showing up that agriculture is ripe for innovation, it's ripe for technology, we really need to land that there's been innovation happening for 10,000 years, right? In terms of human practice and human relationship on the land, it's been a continuous story. And so again, where we find ourselves in that system that we described, the current food system, and all the different impacts and toxic impacts that it is a technologically driven system. We have really been focusing on yields. We have been focusing on a lot of these different areas. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about how these current impacts are showing up. So on the digital divide side, just as a reminder for folks that don't know the concept of the digital divide, it's really about who has access to the digital economy, who has access to broadband and the internet, and who does not. And again, technology being an exacerbator, those that have access get greater equity, and those that don't get greater marginalization. So there's a big focus on broadband and inclusion, and rightfully so. We should really look at digital as a utility and broadband and the internet as a public good. But the way that it's been showing up, and there was a study that was done last year about a lot of AT&T broadband access, both in urban and rural areas in the United States, this concept of digital redlining, of preferencing communities that can pay and marginalizing communities that can't, and again, exacerbating those inequities. On the right side, we're seeing digital fences about, again, we talked about land tenure before, and now being able to really discern different land speculation possibilities and the potential, the massively increased potential for land grabbing. On the intensification side, again, we come back to this aspect that there's been a tremendous amount of growth in yields through intensification technologies. This includes data collection, this includes more precision agriculture and better applications. But what we found out is that the results show that it's not an improvement on the environment, that even though we have an increased yield per acre, we are still expanding the acreage that is being farmed. The environmental impact is still being expanded. And we still have these large rates of hunger and malnutrition all over the world, even though these technologies have helped us increase those yields. On worker equity, this is something that I think is really important. We've shown on the top and kind of bottom sections that we have, 80 to 100 years of automation data and the impact that it has on workers. It's conclusive that it always has a negative impact on workers, right? And that automation doesn't allow people to climb up the corporate ladder, doesn't allow for kind of improved jobs. It expands jobs in certain areas, but it's not that workers graduate from lower wage jobs to higher wage jobs. On the bottom, Stanford Digital Economy Fellow Matt Bean has been talking to me a lot about his work in smart factories that are hyper controlling every aspect of what a worker does, and even roboticizing their movements towards just 10,000 repetitive gestures a day. And he's studying that this level of automation has actually limited productivity, that we don't design machines to be used with workers and advocating for worker health, worker dignity, which can actually help improve throughput overall and improve equity. So he's really studying what are the conditions that we can kind of have wins in these areas across the board, as much as I guess is possible. The other side, and I'm sorry, this is the wrong title, but this is around data privacy and data sovereignty. There's different farming equipment corporations like John Deere that have these end user license agreements, where basically as soon as you turn on the key to your tractor, you are signing the contract of giving away your data, of having limited access to your data potentially, but it's really on the ownership. So there might be some sort of access or some sort of control, but John Deere has a very high, just a lot of legalese in terms of what you can do and what you can't do, as well as because a lot of these tractors have so much computerized software involved that farmers are not allowed to repair their own machines. So they have to take these massive multi-million-dollar machines, transport them to a John Deere approved dealer and repair shop, and then get it transported back, which is a huge impact to what's known as the repair economy, which is still like really thriving in farming communities all over the world. But this is really threatening that. So what I want to kind of end with is, how do we start looking at moving forward with agri-food systems where we can build intersectional equity across these different systems, ecological, health, socioeconomic, and political systems, and just recognizing that we're doing this here at the conference live, right? That each of us has access to the internet, we have video software and capabilities. And so in this instance, we are organizing, we're educating, we're building with each other, and it adds to the equity of how we move forward. There's a couple of other instances, and I know some of the others might get more into this, but just talking about open source platforms like FarmOS and Open Teams, the potential to really think about procurement platforms that align with platforms like the Good Food Purchasing Program, where we can look at sourcing from BIPOC farmers and having vendor databases with AI attached to them, could be really interesting. We've heard from food service directors in schools here in the US that they can increase from scratch cooking to improve health and improve the regional food economy if they have modernized equipment in their kitchens that help them, such as automated bread machines, that really help them build out a adequate and full food service operation in schools, which would be a dramatic improvement from kind of the commodity school food system that is right now. And then on the worker side, thinking about worker equity through information feedback loops, through communication feedback loops, we've seen this sort of knowledge transfer actually happen quite a bit in Africa, Asia, and Latin America with smallholder farmers. We haven't seen it as much in the global north with farm worker communities that really don't get access to a lot of these tools, for a host of different reasons. So that's a lot, and I'm sorry that I sped through it all, but I'm going to stop and then hand it over to David to take it all up. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Samir. That was great. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully you can see my screen. All right, so Samir did a great job just getting us started on a lot of the foundation. And one thing, and we should appreciate that there's a lot in this space, and I will entreat you to read more and explore more for yourself. My name is David Selassie Opoku. I am a farmer and a technologist that works on a family farm in Accra, Ghana, called Growing Gold Farms. And what we set out to do at Growing Gold Farms is how can we create sustainable food experiences for Ghanaians? My family has been into farming before I was born, so for about 40 years or more. And here I'm showing a picture of Ghana and all the different glimpses you can catch if you search on the internet and more. And the ability to see this, or the reason why I can see this, is Ghana believes that there should be freedom and justice for all. So that is captured in the Black Star Gate if you come to Accra. And so for me, thinking about a food system that supports a society, a community like that, the question is, how do you make this a reality? And for us as Growing Gold Farms, we translate this, or we interpret this as sustainability across 5 different dimensions. We believe that the food system that we build should be physiologically sustainable. Whoever interacts with it should have a good well-being, a good living. It should be communal. So whatever community it intersects with should thrive, should be sustainable, should move from the place that it used to be in a negative sense to a place where it is succeeding beyond what it was met with. Economic, the income, the livelihood, financially, they should thrive in that sense. Environmental, everything we do should benefit the environment, because the environment is an asset that cannot just be thrown away or destroyed and replaced. And then finally, there is a spiritual aspect to food systems. We believe that God has given us the ability to produce food as a way to interact with fellow human beings and show that love, but at the same time to interact and appreciate the divine. So for us as Growing Gold, this is the dimensions with which we look at the food system that we try to develop and espouse. And I think this will be the lens with which I'll talk through the journey that I've been going through since I left my full-time job as a technologist, somebody working in data, to look at ways that we can develop a food system with my family that makes sense, that creates the sustainable food experiences we're looking for. So just quickly, a simplified version of what a food value chain could look like. You have your input providers, most at the beginning. You have some actors that are producing, involved in production. Then we have actors involved in processing and distribution, then marketing, and then the consumer. Again, this is an oversimplification, but it gives you a sense of the different stages that I want to dissect different food systems along. With this, I'm going to be looking at 4 axes. Given the food system and given the 5 different stages that I've talked about, what do the actors, the worker, or the communities look like? What are their locations? What resources do they have? And then what profits do they have along these stages? So I'll start with what I call the commercial local Ghanaian food system. And basically what this is farmers producing for the local population. So you have a farmer who decides that they want to produce primarily to be able to make an income for some group of people. What you should pay attention to primarily is where I have colored in red. That is the production part, because that is what I am particularly familiar with. So we tend to have a farmer who's usually located in a rural community, tends to have limited resources, and the profits that they tend to gain tend to be low. Contrasting that, you have the input suppliers usually being multinational companies. They tend to be international, primarily from the West. Their resources tend to be proprietary, vast, and private, and their profits tend to be high and tend to be focused on their shareholders. Then I'll go to the second type of agri-food system, is the commercial export, and this is usually cash crop. So we're talking about cocoa, we're talking about shea, we're talking about things that farmers produce, and the idea being that they send it off somewhere. They usually do not actually use any of these products, but this is coming from colonial systems that we can discuss later. And again, production in red, because then the actor over here is the farmer. Again, they tend to be in a rural location, tend to have limited resources, low profits. Inputs in this state usually tends to come from government agencies. They're local also, the resources are public, medium to high, and then the profits also tend to be usually low. But then we see multinational companies primarily in charge and owning the processing, distribution, and marketing, primarily based in Europe, North America. Their resources are private but high, and the profits they are making medium to high, as you can put that. So you can start to see some level of disparity when we are proposing a system of farming that says commercial, whether local or exports, should be the way that farmers should go. And the question that I want to put to us is, if we think about justice, if we think about freedom, who is benefiting? Is this a just system? And I'll leave that to you for the discussion later. I want to present subsistence farming, which has been vilified, and subsistence farming being farming where a farmer provides for his or her household, not with the goal of making a profit or selling things off, but with the goal of making sure that her family is sustained, her community is sustained. And I argue that if you look at this farming system all across the 5 different stages, it tends to be much more communal, where the actors tend to be the farmer or the local community across board. Location tends to be local, so you're not having transportation, effects on the environment, wastage as much. Resources tend generally to be communal, and if there are any profits, it's reinvested locally. So when we think about the values of a free and just system again, comparing the 2 main types, subsistence farming seems to be much closer to what we want to see in a free and just system. Yes, we can talk about not having a high yield, but I'll come to that later in ways that we can think about how digital technologies can be an avenue to mitigation this. So again, using growing goals, 5 dimensions, and if we try to map this out across an axis, we can see commercial local may be doing well on 2 of these axes. Physiological, providing food for the people who need it to some extent. Economic, yes. Commercial exports, most of the time, is focusing on how do we make as much profit as possible. Subsistence tend to check a lot of the boxes, maybe not economic, But if I had to choose one for myself again, I think subsistence is looking more fair and just. This article was actually shared by my mom today, came yesterday, and it was talking about how those people are making the case that African farmers deserve access to innovations that transformed farming in the developed world. And from Samir's presentation, is that really what we want to see? I think that's the question. Are we assessing that on the dimensions that we need to see it when it comes to a free and just system? I don't think there's anything wrong with technology as it is, but in what way are we optimizing that for whatever food system that exists? And I think that's the question. So when we talk about these technologies, usually, one thing you would see is that most of the celebrated innovations in farming technology at the moment are built and owned by actors outside the lived food production context. Even locally, most of these people are building these because they are not part of the system and they are thinking about it in a way to optimize what makes sense to them, most of the time being yield. This was a report from 2019 that gives a sense of the 100+ technology companies changing farming, everything from next-gen farms to management software, precision agriculture, all the exciting things that people want to have present in Ghanaian and African farms. And if you look at them, none of them are African. Of the top 100 are African. So what does that tell us? We're now trying to see a centralization of values, a centralization of power in a specific space that is not necessarily thinking about the localized values that these communities may care about. And so what problems is that setting up? What issues is that creating that later on has to be fixed or has to be dealt with? What I propose or what I think we can look at is if we are looking at the Ag Tech 3.0 as Samir talked about, I believe there are ways that digital technologies can make subsistence farming more economic if we want to make them. It's just that farmers out of choice didn't see the need to because, again, they didn't believe that was a priority for them necessarily in the communities that exist. But if we want to look at these three systems of farming, subsistence farming stands the best chance of applying digital technologies to make them much more ideal, much more free, much more just, compared to digital commercial local or digital commercial exports, which are flawed in the sense because they are optimizing for the wrong thing. So this is one thing, and I think this is going to be the recurring lyric throughout the conversation, is that any system that primarily optimizes for yield, AKA profits, AKA power, will eventually dehumanize vulnerable people, irrespective of technology. Technology just speeds it up. And so this is what we're talking about. This is what we want to bring our attention to and think about ways that we can make sure that we are optimizing the right values, the right outcomes out of the food system. And so for us as Growing Gold, what we're learning is that it's a journey that has to start by first humanizing the lives and stories of farmers in their communities. And I can go on later on the ways that we can do that. We need to equip farmers in their communities to understand the implications of food technologies for themselves so that they can decide whether they want to use drones and give their data away or not, because it doesn't fit into their values. And then finally, we need to make sure that these farmers and their communities are becoming the originators and owners of these food technologies. What would it look like if, as Samir talked about, we have more open platforms, we have data that is shared across and owned by the community? What could that look like as opposed to these communities being constantly seen and driven to the position of just consumers of these technologies and the implications that leads to? So I'll end by mentioning Cocoa 360, which is an organization that was started by a Ghanaian who comes from a farming family and had the opportunity to go to university in the US. And because of what he has experienced and what he's seen, he believed that there's a better model to farming And he's built this model that focuses on the combination of community-centered farming, decision-making, incorporation of techniques and technologies, centering around education of community members, healthcare, and then generally thinking about ways to turn a cocoa farm into a much more community-owned, technology-driven business. And so with that, I'll stop here. And the question I'll leave to us all as we discuss is, what and who are food systems optimizing for in your community? And is it leading to a free and just system? Thank you.
So I think I'm up next. Okay, great. I will just share my screen. Can everybody see that? Awesome. Okay, so I just want to start today with the words from a colleague of mine, Manish Rosada, who's a plant geneticist that's doing research around what he calls sustainable agriculture kits. And these kit, what the aim is to get cheap, fairly simple, effective tools like this $2 metal corn sheller into the hands of smallholder farmers, typically working small areas of land. And so what these tools do is they really, they increase the income, reduce the labor, improve crop health, production of for small farmers. And it's really about asking farmers what they need instead of adopting, sort of expecting farmers, especially small farmers, to adopt and purchase technologies, seeds, expensive inputs, and things like that. And the reason why I wanted to open up with this is because I wanted to start by illustrating my support for what David and Samir have been saying, and sort of expand on some of this and some of the themes. So when I asked Manish about some of the agricultural technologies that he was speaking of, he replied, when speaking of genetically modified seeds and agricultural technology specifically, that smallholder farmers need about 100 things more urgently than they need many of these kinds of technologies that are being promoted to them right now. And so he said, you know, when you start from a situation where small scale farmers are growing usually subsistence crops, and then trying to promote extremely capital intensive technologies, you're going to cause a lot of problems, right? You're going to cause displacement, dispossession, upheaval. And so I think, again, I just wanted to open with those thoughts because I think that they really illustrate for me the connection between sort of how agricultural technologies can deepen inequity, marketization. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the context of data and then land itself. So in the context of data, the production of data and technology, I've been working with Kelly Bronson, who's at U Ottawa, and we've been working on systemic biases in agricultural data. And what we found is that scientific decision-making in terms of agricultural technologies, both in the private and the public sector, clearly favors the kinds of farmers that both of you were talking about, you know, productivist farmers growing commodity crops on large acreages, and increasingly sort of what we define as precision farming systems. And I'll get a little bit more into that later. And so after looking at specifically the ag software development industry, we found that the vast majority of agricultural big data sets really fed into predictive analytics in ways that collect only data on the major crops, such as corn, as opposed to various horticultural crops, fruits and vegetables, root vegetables, things like that, more subsistence and local crops. And so the thing is that these biases in big data toward large scale commodity crops and capital rich farmers, they don't only result from, but they also reinforce the privatization and commercialization of ag technologies and also information transfer. So you're sort of building information based on that sort of presumption. And because agricultural data is now becoming such an important form of capital, right? People are calling it the resource of the future. So given the economic value in agricultural data, now, of course, you're seeing corporations rushing to collect and control this data in really, really problematic ways. And so at the same time, what our research found is that not only are non-industrial or subsistence farmers, but also data scientists who are working on issues relevant to organic, regenerative, and agroecological farming, that they're actually being limited by the data. They can't access a lot of the data, and there's sort of no data being able to be actually produced for them. So now you're reinforcing further inequities. And so we also see that this sort of machine intelligence, it encourages this very narrow expertise. And so much of the experiential knowledge of more diverse farming systems, such as this image here, this farm here, it's not actually being even built into and then accounted for in the actual development and production of smart farming technologies. And then this further limits the breadth of data being created. So it's really even at the production end that we really have to think about how this reinforces things, inequities. So precision farming advocates argue that, for instance, automated it's what that chart that you presented, Samir. I think that was great. So I'm not going to get too much into what that is, what precision ag is, but they argue that automated decision systems mean fewer laborers, right? Yet at the same time, many farm managers and workers now merely become what we think of as machine minders. And this really helps to build data sets without any benefits from the farmer and certainly not the worker, because their information then is getting transferred away from labor and into capital and private platforms, and then the companies that control them. And so knowledge, capacity, and skill are increasingly moving now from workers into fixed commercial capital, and then science and technology is that entry for capital into the production process. And so, of course, this is going to work really, really well for powerful actors who actually have control and ownership over this capital. And at the same time, we also see that although privatization dominates this innovation landscape, corporations are heavily supported by public money and science, as well as farmer-collected data. So I think it's not purely just about privatization. I mean, neoliberalism is a really complicated phenomenon and process. So in Canada, for example, commercial digital ag tools are being supported by public sector funding like the Supercluster Initiative, with digitalization following that historic pattern of government privileging the goals of only a narrow sort of range of agricultural stakeholders, again, further reinforcing these inequities. And in the North American context, at least, as Samir mentioned, this has really been built by and for settler people, settler governments, white settler corporations, and has evolved through deep labor inequities and exploitation. And in fact, one thing I talk a lot about is the way that the industrial food system has been able to grow. It's actually been able to grow in the way that it did. And labor activists talk about this all the time, that it was actually premised on labor exploitation alongside land theft through structures of settler colonialism, enslavement, and racism. So, for instance, we know that white settler expansion over agricultural lands is a direct result from Indigenous dispossession, along with this sort of ongoing reliance on migrant labor. So it's no surprise then that current farmland, as Samir, as you mentioned, that the current farmland base and industry is nearly entirely owned and managed by white settler farmers. And so sort of connecting this to the issue of land, I've been doing some research with Kelly Bronson, Andre Magnon, and Emily Duncan on connecting the issue with land and ag tech. So for instance, we know that ag tech startups are rapidly growing. So venture capital investments have contributed over 2.8 billion in ag tech startups alone. So the thing is, though, researchers, activists, we don't actually have a clear sense of the direct role of digital agriculture in land grabbing and in land financialization and assetization. So assetization is it's really the transformation of things into resources which can generate income without having to sell them. So farmland assetization means you're transforming the land into a financial asset, which involves the creation of certain legal, material, like organizational conditions that then allow investors to profit not only from the productive value of the land, but its capital appreciation. So it's a little bit different than just financialization. So essentially what it does is it deepens the commodification of land and it really brings it into the global market more firmly. So the problem here is that it could reinforce farmland concentration, land speculation, things like that, right? So for instance, companies like SIBO, and Tillable that I'm showing here, they use big data tools for farmland valuation. And Tillable is an online farmland management platform, and they're already making very clear direct links between farmland investment and digital agriculture. And so our research is trying to better understand how data is actually being used in farmland transactions and also in processes of valuation for land management decisions as well. So not only by farmers and farm owners, but also farm investors. And then what are the consequences of that? What actually happens when that transfer of ownership takes place? So companies like Tillable and Nuveen see farmland investment as this idea of, I think Nuveen said this money under the mattress. It's a lower risk investment with high returns over time. And so we also see that farmers see the capacity to grow their land base through leasing and through expansion. And so what's happening is firms like Tillable are actually seeing that waves of technological innovation can actually facilitate that further, let's say. And that's kind of what you were saying, David, about how, technology can sort of further advance something that's already kind of happening. So for these firms, big data and related technologies are seen as drivers of increased productivity, right? Higher yields, and this is going to make farmland more appealing. This isn't really new, but Tillable states that because yield influences farm revenue, having strong yield data is going to substantiate higher price for your farm, and then more interest in the market, in the farmland investment market. And so the reason why many farmers are now adopting technologies is then to increase the size of their farm and then maximize their yield subsequently. And so firms like Nuveen, though, point to the technological advances like precision guided tractors, sprayers, planters, robotics, AI, as ways for investors to monitor and surveil farmer decision-making in order to maximize yields. So they're actually really starting to get clarity around those connections for investors. And so these companies then encourage farmers to share the data, right, generated from these precision agricultural tools with landowners. And then some investment models actually have incorporated this into their core business model as actually a requirement for farmers to participate. And so these data development and investment firms then still remain kind of opaque, similar to Google, right? You see this with Google or Amazon, really unclear about how much decision-making and data is still in the hands of the farmer or the user or the client, and then which is in the hands of the investor and how they take up that data. So with these incentives to expand, then this new requirement to participate is likely only going to further limit farmers' choices and options for land management. And then actually, of course, who gets to be on the land. So this is already going to be those who have a lot of capital, assets, intergenerational wealth. So it's going to leave even less room for aspiring farmers, people who don't have that intergenerational wealth, new immigrant farmers, farmers of color, indigenous farmers. Like, I think it's going to even further, of course, marginalize. So this kind of gets into this idea of farming as a service, right? Which looks, again, very similar to software as a service, such as Google Apps. And so what is happening is that digital technologies are enabling this farmer as a service model by making the labor that's actually performed by tenant farmers or farm workers more visible through the very particular kinds of data collection. So farmers are still able to do the labor, but they don't actually have to own the land, and they don't have to sort of pursue that path of land ownership. Meanwhile, their knowledge, their skill, and power are transferred from the farmer and the farm workers towards the technology itself. So it's no surprise why folks are worried that agricultural technologies are going to, likely just continue to be developed and deployed in ways that surveil and discipline migrant farm workers rather than being used to improve their working conditions, improve their well-being, worker health, and also, of course, work towards paths to citizenship and liberation and access to resources in more substantive ways, right? It's really just about maintaining the system as it currently is. And many farm managers have also expressed this similar kind of visibility or surveillance. And, what remains the same is that the same kinds of farm practices are what remain visible. So some of the digital tools and relationships that are being forged between landowners and investors involve that process of surveillance and disciplining farmers. So Tillable suggests that landowners, quote, that if their farmers don't want to share data with you, it may be time to start thinking about changing farmland tenants. So farmers are expected then to present themselves to landowners as worthy tenants by sharing their data, their experience, and their commitment to very particular kinds of farming, industrial scale, precision forms of models of farming. And so when situated within the context of capitalist rationality of production and conventional agriculture, these kinds of surveillance are going to likely just deepen, as David and Samir, you both said, deepen current relations of inequity. So what I think is even perhaps more worrisome is actually the way that these firms are taking up or portraying this kind of digital data as highly sustainable, environmentally, socially sustainable. And it's presenting their activities as this sort of force for good in communities, but in ways that are obscuring the capital and class relations. So they're not being clear about the land dispossession that's underpinning their activities. So at the same time, this kind of sort of surveillance facilitates a certain way of seeing, right? The market logic, the rationality, the sort of algorithmic governmentality of sort of making sense of land as an asset. And so farmers become very objectified, and their experiential knowledge becomes discredited. And so I think what this is going to do is that land becomes an asset for the investor classes in the global marketplace and is going to be further removed from communities or any semblance of democratic and sort of participatory governance. And then in terms of the data production side, the vast majority of government funding in agriculture is still designated for, as I said, expanding, commercializing conventional agriculture, with very little research being done around bioregional, socio-ecological diversity, agroecological practices, any of that sort of thing. And we also know that in order to meaningfully address a lot of the concerns that you had raised, Samir, around labor exploitation, racism, colonialism, government funds and bureaucracies need to be directing things towards those kinds of programs that prioritize social and ecological health and land access for marginalized communities. So I'll leave it at that, but thanks for letting me share.
Good afternoon. My name is Erik Nicholson. I'm coming from the traditional lands of the Wanapum and the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, Nez Perce, and Yakima in Eastern Washington. For the last 30 years, I've had the honor of working with farm workers, the essential women and men who put food on our tables every day, and without whose labor we would not eat. During COVID-19, when society finally publicly recognized these women and men as essential, for many of us who'd been in the trenches for decades, it felt like redemption. We knew implicitly and explicitly without their labor, the United States would not eat and many people around the world would also suffer. And this comes in after decades of these same women and men being disparaged, forgotten, isolated, and discriminated against in their terms of employment, where they live, and in public discourse. Yet, unfortunately, too quickly, that determination of essential became a real curse. The federal government and frankly, US consumers did absolutely nothing to protect these people that had just been deemed essential. They did not have the luxury of quarantining from home, and instead every day had to go to work, many times without masks, without social distancing, without access to hand washing equipment, and without access to real information about the workplace hazards. They did so to continue to feed us. And as a result, in the United States, the Latinx community paid a disproportionately high price in the COVID-19 pandemic, costing many workers their health and their lives. Earl Edwards on the left of the slide was a Jamaican national employed at one of the largest sweet cherry growers in the United States. When he became symptomatic with COVID-19, he was isolated in a labor camp. His wife, Marcia, told me every day she was calling him and increasingly concerned about his declining health. At no point during his time in the labor camp was he ever provided medical attention. Earl collapsed, was taken to a hospital, and died. He was the second worker at this large farm who was killed as a result of COVID-19, with Juan Carlos Rincon, a Mexican national, dying 3 weeks prior at the exact same labor camp. We actually had to petition the state government here in the state of Washington to require growers to provide medical attention to workers who became symptomatic on their farms. What an indictment of the lack of humanity of our industry. I think it's important to also, as we've been doing, center the conversation about agriculture and agricultural workers around the current themes of Black Lives Matter. Had Black Lives mattered in the United States in the 1930s, frankly, we would not be in the situation in which we currently find ourselves. When major labor laws were being debated in the US Congress, such as the National Labor Relations Act, which provides a legal framework for unionization, or the Fair Labor Standards Act, which provides radical things like overtime, the right to paid breaks, the Southern congressional delegation was very clear that they had no interest that then the Black farm workers did enjoy equal protection as their white counterparts. And as a result, actively excluded those women and men from coverage. And as a result, today around the country, workers still labor 12, 16 hours without getting overtime pay, and in many states without having a right to a 10-minute paid break. Fast forward to 2015, in a community about 10 kilometers away from where I am currently, Ernesto Zambrano was shot down 17 times by a police officer in broad daylight. Ernesto was a farm worker. He suffered an injury, a debilitating injury in his workplace, was unable to provide for his family, became emotionally increasingly despondent, and as a result, one day when he was walking downtown Pasco, started throwing rocks at a police patrol. The officer got out and executed Ernesto in the street with impunity. Had Black Lives mattered, Ernesto would be with us today. As the previous panelists have already spoke very eloquently, I loved how David framed this, and previous panelists then really took it home. There is a feeding frenzy right now in agriculture around what in the terminology I hear, precision agriculture. And as Sarah talked about, this is not in the interest of farmers. It is not in the interest of farm workers. It is in the interest of investment capital, who, as she shared, has invested $2.8 billion in this industry to harvest data, to harvest wealth, and concentrate power. It's estimated that robots will generate about $11.58 billion by 2025. So imagine you're a farm worker, and your employer brings out an autonomous tractor. And yet when you go to the bathroom, you're there with 10 of your closest friends sitting on the pot with absolutely no privacy. Then you go to drink water, and it's 100 degrees or north of 40 degrees centigrade, and you don't have drinking cups. And you have to humiliate yourself drinking out of the spigot one after another, or God forbid, drink from a disgusting water jug. What's the message that technology is sending to you as an essential worker about your value in this society? Those messages are not lost, and they're debilitating and they're infuriating. As Sarah talked about, technology also is going to bring about radical changes in how farming occurs and the impact on land tenancy. Where I live in Eastern Washington, it's home of one of the largest tree fruit industries in the world. A traditional orchard is what you see here, which would be a three-dimensional canopy, a very complex set of branches and twigs that makes it impossible to deploy any type of robotic or digital technology. The new frame is looking like a very high vineyard, where you have a two-dimensional frame, two-dimensional planting, trellised, highly labor-intensive. And right now, to transition from the traditional orchard to this style, you're talking about $60,000 to $85,000 an acre. Then you have to wait 3 to 5 years for those trees to start producing, just to be able to catch up with the current technology. Debt loads for farmers across the United States are record highs, and they have not been higher since the 1980s. And as a result, there's only pretty much one way that you can obtain the capital needed simply to replant your fields in order to be ready for precision agriculture, is what you sell at equity positions. So we currently have an orchard here in Eastern Washington that is owned by the Ontario, Canada Teachers Union Pension Fund. And they are extracting, their goal is 8% return for the teachers of Ontario at the expense of our community and the people that are harvesting the apples. And it'd be remiss not to point out that their logo actually is an apple. So, there's already been a good conversation about data, but I think it's really important to highlight, in talking with a technological expert here in the state of Washington and about data ownership, he mentioned this movie to me. I had not seen it, and it's the story of farmers in the Southern California mountains, Tehachapi Mountains, the turn of the 20th century. It's based on an Upton Sinclair novel, that were struggling mightily. Their farms were consistently failing because there was a noxious black liquid that killed anything and everything they came in contact with. A speculator comes from the East Coast, sees these farmers' plight, sees how badly they're suffering, and offers to buy the farms from these farmers. And the farmers think, oh my God, what a wonderful godsend. Thank you, thank you, thank you. They did not understand that what he was actually buying were the oil rights to the land that they had. And so they actually sold their farms penny on the dollar. And has been already discussed, that is the play. And it is a very disturbing play because there's not an honest conversation about data. And I would suggest that these robotic harvesters are as much about picking an apple as Facebook is about connecting friends and family. It is about generating one of the new KPIs, data per acre, and who owns it and to whose benefit will not be for farm workers, growers, or our rural communities that we treasure so much. So where's this going? For many of us, it's very clear that, even if we're on the labor side, we're trying to unionize the taxi cab drivers. The growers own the taxi cabs, and we're both about to get punked because Silicon Valley and the investment community is working to develop an app that's going to make both of us irrelevant. So we can stay the course and be disrupted, or we can decide that we're going to become the disruptors. And that's what I want to talk about, is that in my experience of working with farm workers, there's no other segment in agriculture who know more about what really happens than these essential women and men. They're in the fields day in, day out. They are the true experts. So what we believe, rather than being the bugs that hit the windshield, it's time for us to become the windshield. And the first step of that is to re-envision who farm workers are. And we are right now collaborating with a group of workers to help them re-envision who they can be. They are not people that are simply hired for manual labor. They are passionate people about working the land and feel, as David talked about, that spiritual connection of producing food for the world and sort of a labor around which they're tremendously proud. Yet rightly see the deployment of technology that does nothing to address the litany of risks, of challenges they face in their daily employment as a real threat. So we have put forward the thesis, well, how about if you have the tools to deploy it and create technology yourself? And this has been a fascinating conversation that we have been working through. Now, in order to do that, it's not just, we need to upskill workers and check the box and mission accomplished. There is a legacy of slavery, of racism that infuses agriculture production. So in working with a number of growers around the West Coast, surveying over 800 workers, talking to technological experts, retailers, community members, we identified both what is our desired outcome in terms of how to redefine the culture of agriculture so workers' voice is welcomed, it's embraced, they're given the tools and knowledge needed to be the true innovative force of agriculture, and that we can reward their employers systematically. We're now in the process of deconstructing this, what we consider a wicked problem, which is of such complexity that there is no single solution, yet we need an array of solutions to work through this. This is a race. Silicon Valley is very clear that they want to develop and be the dominant players in determining how and what agriculture is, to the detriment of rural communities, farmers, and the wonderful women and men I've had the honor of working with. So our challenge is, how do we recreate and become the innovators, the disruptors, faster than them? We need your help to be first across the finish line. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of passion, and just really brilliant insight. We just have a couple minutes left, and I just wanted to maybe start out with a broader question that each of you could tackle. So let's say that, all the major ag tech investors, the private investors, the government investors have watched this session. And now they're rechecking all of their notions and framings and feeling like, oh, we need to shift our gears in terms of how we're investing in technologies to show up to support equity. I'm just, each of you, where should they start? What do you think that they should do? What would you like to point them towards? How do we work that? So maybe I'll just kind of select, this is how we do this here. So I'll start with Sarah.
Thanks, Samir. I think that there's a lot more reflection that would need to be happening sort of again at the kind of production end. So things like data sets could be built to sort of capture and encourage more complex ecosystem variables, outputs for non-commercial farmers. Efficiency as a benchmark, that should be replaced. We shouldn't be using efficiency as a benchmark, but it should be replaced by diversity or complexity or soil health, labor equity. Like, there's all sorts of other ways that we could think about this. And then I think there's a sort of there's an issue around privatization, and so but it's not only privatization. I think it's more complicated than that. So I don't want to just say it's just publicly driven data development, but also the kinds of publicly driven development that is specifically prioritizing well-being, agroecological diversity, worker health, the health of populations that are going to be bearing the brunt of this. But I think decision makers need to ask how agricultural or can ag technology be used to sort of move away from market-based agricultural land regimes. I don't actually know the answer to that. So I think, how do we avoid having land be marketized in this global sense, or assetized in this way? I think avoiding that is probably pretty significant. So at the same time, how do we then redesign bureaucratic systems of programming and decision making to ensure that those populations that have been made marginal, I think that's important to say, it's not just marginalized, but folks who have been like systemically made marginalized in the food system, that they have strong upfront visioning, governance, and advisory capacity. I think I see so often when I talk to folks in government that there's so little real like a level of like honoring knowledge and sort of like, what is, how could systems of governance change to reflect true nation to nation decision making, for instance? What would that have to look like? What would bureaucracies, how would knowledge production and bureaucracies have to change away from white settler sort of mindsets, right? And so it quickly becomes a larger political question, right? Towards more deeper, transformative, disruptive processes and ways of knowing. And I think you've all said it, that technology can't just be placed into the same political system or landscape, and then we assume that technology is going to offer any transformative potential, because it's not. So we need to sort of transform and disrupt the political systems, but also our relationships to land and food and that sort of thing, to prioritize equity and equitable control over land and ecological systems and all of that sort of thing. So it's like, it's a big, it's a big task.
Thanks, Sarah. And I know that you're just kind of teasing at what some of the needs are, and then perhaps even where the opportunities could also be, thinking of a framing maybe of food as a public good, food as a human right. And so how does technology then serve that sort of direction once it's really been charted out by those that we are trying to center? David, how would you tackle kind of that bigger framing question?
I think if they had to start, the first thing is to acknowledge that they don't know anything about agriculture and what it takes to do it right. So just accept that, and then go to the communities, paying attention to communities that are diverse and they have different values that they've built over generations that make food work the way it should for the community, and allow them to tell their stories. Allow them to let people understand what it takes to produce the food that make us thrive, and humanize them. So there are different ways, but I think there has to be a vast level of education from these communities around what is working and what is not working right, before we can figure out, okay, what is the next step that we take? So that would be what I'll say: accept that we know nothing about how food works and what it takes to deliver what we've been enjoying for years and generations, and allow these communities, these workers, to tell their stories about what it takes to be a human being that produces food, that sacrifices time to give us what we have, and what is required to make the system better, more human. So that's what I'll start with. And what that could look like would be everything from them having their own TV programs, radio programs, just making it easy for people to see them and appreciate the struggle. I think that'll be a start, and then the innovations and solutions can come after that.
Thanks, David. I also just want to bring in some of the aspects from your talk, that it's not just about how do we educate these investors or designers, but also give up power, right? So where can those farmers actually have ownership, have control over these technologies, that any innovations or improvements, we're just going out and trying to seek information and not being reciprocal with that. It's also an extractive type of application unless we give up that sort of power. Erik, I'll go to you for kind of the last word on that question.
Yeah, I think David and Sarah both teed it up really well. It's having the conversation, but doing so in good faith, that you're not there to figure out how you can further extract wealth from our communities, but enhance our communities. And that you're doing in true partnership. Sarah talked very well about the importance of governance, right? That you have people that are passionate about the production of food, yet we have designed the production of food to be highly extractive, highly exploitative, and extremely racist. And you have those of us that have committed our lives to make that different. We're not the wonderful entrepreneurs you're thinking. We're communities. We are people who are passionate. We need access to capital to transform agriculture into something that is humane and more consistent with the values that you lined up in the beginning, Samir.
I think that's a great last sentiment. How can we be more humane? How can we be more values aligned? Well, I just want to thank each of you, Erik, David, and Sarah. Thanks so much to the attendees. There were some great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them, but this is a live conversation. We want to continue having it. I know it's really important for the Stanford Race and Tech program at the various centers. So yeah, there'll be a lot more to dig into, but thanks y'all and have a great rest of your day.